What if the attack against Joe's family was not simply the work of Russian intelligence? And what if the biggest threat facing the Lioness team in Season 3 is not somewhere overseas, hiding behind a foreign intelligence service, but sitting inside the very organization Joe and Caitlyn have spent their lives protecting? Because after everything that happened in Episode 3, one possibility is becoming harder and harder to ignore. There may be a traitor inside the system. And if Kaitlyn Meade is the first person to discover it, Episode 4 could completely change the direction of Season 3. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're breaking down everything we know about Lioness Season 3 Episode 4, titled Murder Hornets, and we're going much deeper than simply discussing the official synopsis. We're going to examine the ending of Episode 3. We're going to look at Joe's situation. We're going to talk about Oleksandra. We're going to examine the Russian connection. We're going to look at Caitlyn's position inside the CIA. And most importantly, we're going to explore the possibility that Caitlyn could uncover a betrayal from someone inside the American intelligence apparatus. Now, let me make something very clear before we begin. Episode 4 has not aired yet. So this video is a preview and theory breakdown, not a claim that every event we're discussing has already been confirmed. But that's exactly what makes this episode so interesting. Because the clues are already there. And Taylor Sheridan has spent this season putting pieces on the board that may not make sense until everything suddenly comes together. So stay with me until the end because I believe the biggest question heading into Episode 4 isn't simply, how does Joe get out? The bigger question is, who put Joe in there in the first place? Let's start with the ending. Episode 3 completely changed the game. Joe and her team were already dealing with an enormous threat. Her home had been attacked. Her family was becoming increasingly exposed. The danger that Joe had spent years keeping away from her personal life had finally crossed the line. And this is important because Joe has always understood the risks of her job. She knows people can die. She knows missions can fail. She knows enemies can retaliate. But there is a difference between being attacked professionally and having someone come directly after your family. That distinction is one of the major themes of Season 3. Joe is no longer fighting a war that stays inside a mission file. The war is following her home. And then came Alexandra. At first, she looked like exactly what the CIA feared. A possible Russian double agent. Someone whose actions may have helped expose American operations. Someone who could potentially be responsible for information getting into the wrong hands. But then the story became much more complicated. Alexandra denied being a Russian double agent. And instead of simply defending herself, she presented a counterintelligence strategy. The plan involved creating the impression that the Americans had captured a major Russian figure. The goal was not simply to deceive Russia. The goal was to watch who reacted. Who made contact. Who panicked. Who suddenly changed their behavior. Who attempted to move information. That is classic counterintelligence thinking. You don't always find the mole by searching directly for the mole. Sometimes you create information that only the mole should know. Then you watch where it goes. And that brings us to the most dangerous possibility of all. What happens if the information doesn't go where Joe expects? What happens if the information reaches someone inside the American system? That is where Caitlyn comes in. Kaitlyn Meade is one of the most important characters in this entire storyline. And what makes her fascinating is that she isn't Joe. Joe is the field operator. Joe gets into dangerous situations. Joe personally carries out the mission. Joe is willing to put herself between the threat and everyone else. Caitlyn operates differently. She studies. She analyzes. She calculates. She makes decisions based on intelligence. And when the situation becomes chaotic, Caitlyn doesn't necessarily panic. She becomes quieter. More strategic. That characterization has been reinforced by Nicole Kidman's comments about Caitlyn this season. Kidman has described Caitlyn as someone who is highly strategic, deeply patriotic, and capable of compartmentalizing enormous pressure rather than simply breaking down. That matters enormously for episode 4. Because if there really is a betrayal inside the CIA, Caitlyn is exactly the kind of person who could identify the pattern. Jo might discover the enemy through action. Caitlyn could discover the enemy through information. And information is where this season becomes extremely dangerous. The CIA believes it is manipulating Russian intelligence. Alexandra has information. Jo has a plan. Caitlyn and Westfield are trying to understand what is actually happening. But every person involved only knows part of the picture. That's the perfect environment for a betrayal. Because a mole doesn't need to know everything. A traitor only needs enough information to cause damage. Maybe they don't know Jo's entire mission. Maybe they only know that an operation is coming. Maybe they don't know the identity of an asset. Maybe they only know where a meeting is taking place. Maybe they don't even realize how much damage their information will cause. And that is why Caitlyn's investigation could become so important. She may begin noticing something that doesn't make sense. A name appearing where it shouldn't. An operation being compromised too quickly. A Russian response is happening faster than expected. A piece of information moving through a channel that should have been secure. A person receiving information they should never have had. These tiny inconsistencies could become the breadcrumbs leading Caitlyn toward the truth. And this fits perfectly with the official Season 3 setup. Paramount has described the season around hidden networks, foreign operatives, and personal betrayals. It also specifically teases a world where patterns appear where they shouldn't, names disappear, and paths rearrange. That language is extremely important. Because, patterns appear where they shouldn't sounds less like a straightforward enemy attack, and more like an intelligence mystery. Now let's talk about Jo. Because the episode 3 flash-forward changes everything. We see Jo apparently in Russian custody. She is restrained. A press conference is playing. And suddenly the plan she helped create appears to have gone terribly wrong. But here's the question. Was Jo actually captured because the Russians outsmarted the CIA? Or was Jo's location somehow exposed? Those are two completely different possibilities. If Russian intelligence simply outplayed Jo, then the problem is external. But if somebody inside the American system gave the Russians enough information to locate her, then Jo's capture is the result of betrayal. And that would be much more devastating. Because Jo has always operated under the assumption that the people around her are on the same side. She may disagree with Caitlyn. She may argue with Westfield. She may question decisions. But she fundamentally believes she is working within a system designed to protect America. What happens when that assumption disappears? What happens when she realizes the danger wasn't just outside the walls, it was inside them? There is another reason Caitlyn could become central to episode 4. Caitlyn has already seen what happens when intelligence becomes unreliable. She knows that operations are only as strong as the information supporting them. And if Jo is captured despite the plan being carefully constructed, someone is going to have to ask the uncomfortable question, who knew? Not who knew everything. Who knew enough? That question could lead Caitlyn into dangerous territory. Because the more she investigates, the more people she may have to question. And questioning people inside the CIA is not the same as interrogating an enemy. You have to be careful. You can't accuse someone without evidence. You can't reveal the entire investigation. And most importantly, you cannot let the suspected traitor know that you're looking for them. Otherwise, they disappear. Or worse, they strike first. This is where my biggest episode 4 theory comes in. If Caitlyn discovers a betrayal, I don't think it will happen through one giant piece of evidence. I think it will happen through a sequence of small inconsistencies. One conversation. One report. One changed timeline. One missing name. One person who knew something they shouldn't. And then Caitlyn starts connecting the dots. This is much more dangerous than simply finding a villain. Because once Caitlyn suspects an insider, she can't immediately tell everyone. She has to determine how deep the betrayal goes. Is it one person? Two people. A compromised intelligence channel. A foreign asset. Or something much larger. Because if Caitlyn announces that there is a mole and she's wrong, she could destroy an operation. But if she's right and says nothing, people could die. And Joe may already be one of those people. Another major question heading into episode 4 is the relationship between Caitlyn and Byron Westfield. These two operate at a much higher level than Joe. They understand the political consequences. They understand the intelligence consequences. And they also understand that once an operation goes public, there may be no way to control the fallout. Westfield is particularly interesting because he has already shown signs of carrying the psychological weight of this work. He understands what these missions cost, and that makes him different from someone who sees intelligence operations purely as numbers on a screen. If Caitlyn comes to him with evidence of a betrayal, his reaction will matter. Does he believe her? Does he tell her to keep digging? Does he order her to stop? Or does he realize that she has uncovered something that could threaten the entire operation? The relationship between Caitlyn and Westfield could become one of the most important dynamics in episode 4. Because if they disagree, the CIA may effectively be fighting two battles at once. One against the external enemy, and one against itself. Now we have to return to Oleksandra. Because there is still a huge question surrounding her. Is she telling the truth? Her story is complicated. She claims to have information about Americans working with Russia. That includes powerful figures. She presents herself as someone who understands the Russian intelligence network from the inside. But there is always another possibility. What if Alexandre is telling the truth, but the CIA doesn't understand the entire truth? That distinction is crucial. Someone can give you accurate information while still manipulating you. That's one of the oldest principles of intelligence work. You don't ask only, is this information true? You ask, why are they giving it to us? And, what do they want us to do with it? If Alexandra wants the CIA to take a specific action, then that action itself could be part of a larger plan. Perhaps the fake capture of Alexei Yurimov isn't merely bait for Russian intelligence. Perhaps it is bait for someone else. Someone inside the American intelligence structure. That would make the operation far more sophisticated. Imagine this scenario. The CIA announces that it has captured an important Russian operative. Russia reacts. American intelligence watches. But Caitlyn notices something unexpected. A person inside the CIA already seems to know how Russia is going to respond. That doesn't make sense. Unless, they already have a channel into the Russian network. Suddenly, the entire operation changes. Caitlyn isn't just watching Russia. She's watching America. And this is where the title of this video becomes especially important. Caitlyn uncovers a shocking CIA betrayal. The betrayal doesn't necessarily mean someone in the CIA hates America. It could be greed. It could be ideology. It could be coercion. It could be blackmail. It could be someone protecting their own family. It could even be someone who genuinely believes they are doing the right thing. And that would make the betrayal much more dangerous. Because the best traitor isn't necessarily the person who looks evil. Sometimes it's the person who believes they are justified. Let's not forget Joe's family. This season has deliberately made Joe's personal life part of the central conflict. Joe's daughters have already experienced frightening circumstances. They are becoming increasingly aware of what their mother's job actually means. And Joe's husband and children are no longer protected by distance. That changes Joe psychologically. She has always been willing to sacrifice herself. But sacrificing herself is one thing. Putting her family at risk is another. This is exactly why the episode 3 ending is so powerful. Joe's family wants her to walk away. But Joe doesn't believe she can. And that tells us something about the character. Joe doesn't simply see the Lioness program as a job. She sees it as responsibility. She believes that if she walks away, someone else may die. And that mentality is exactly what makes her vulnerable. Because an enemy who understands Joe's sense of duty can manipulate her. Let's consider another possibility. What if Joe wasn't the original target? What if the real target was Caitlyn? Joe may simply be the most effective way to reach her. Think about the relationship. Caitlyn depends on Joe. Joe respects Caitlyn. Caitlyn understands Joe. If someone wanted to destabilize the Lioness program, attacking Joe would be an extremely effective move. And if Joe is captured, Caitlyn has to react. She becomes emotional. She becomes personally invested. And that could force her into making decisions she normally wouldn't make. In other words, Joe could be the bait. Caitlyn could be the target. And the entire operation could be designed to force Caitlyn into exposing something. That possibility would make Episode 4 extremely dangerous. The title of Episode 4 is itself worth discussing. Murder Hornets. That title suggests chaos. Aggression. A swarm. Something that doesn't simply attack once. Something that keeps coming. And that could describe the structure of the episode. Instead of one threat, the Lioness team may face multiple threats simultaneously.